The other question is, can anybody be ever complete? You might be stressed about the conference, you may stress over the time thing, but that's the understanding we have. Next slide, please. The next one will actually talk about what is actually, no, there's one more before. Right. This sounds simple, right? This is the most, this is not the definition, this is a description, I would say. Anybody and anything that moves is migration, more or less, simply put. So what I had before was only that when we talk about migration, we should talk about immigration, people moving out, and immigration, people coming in. But after listening to the question today morning about repatriation, I thought we should also have return migration, which is also movement. One thing I didn't add was there is something known as circular migration, especially labor migrants. I go work for 2 months, come back, then go back and again. So people moving across border, within borders, regardless of time. That's migration. So at least now we know when we talk migration health, you know what is migration and you know what is health, at least what we discussed. Next slide, please. This is a colorful picture. The only idea why, the reason why this is here is because I want to show the region of origin that is on the top and region of destination, how people move. It's obvious there are a lot of people moving within the European region because it's from Europe to Europe because of the EU policies, free movement and everything. If you look at the purple part over there, purple, pink, sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that majority of the migration, this is from 2020, international migration happens within the region, within the continent actually, and the region over here. Can we move on to the next slide? This is an updated figure. That was from 2020, this is from 2025. The green and the yellow shows the green is actually migration within Africa, blue is migration from Africa. You see a change here. There seems to be approximately same proportion of individuals moving outside of Africa and within Africa, which was not the case in 2020. I don't know why exactly the case, but just show that the patterns change, but still a lot of migration is happening within the continent and within the region. Next slide, please. Right. So the question is actually, why are we here? Why are we talking about policy if you want to talk about health per se? And also, why is health of migrants important? And this is a discussion I had with my colleagues yesterday, with Mary and many other colleagues. I'll try to explain that with one slide. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Next one. Right. This is what we know as the determinant of health model. The circle in there, that's the individual. It could be anybody. In this case, it's a migrant. And all the factors you see around it, the lifestyle factors, what kind of food I eat, do I cycle, do I exercise, do I smoke? The lifestyle factors, the community, the friends, the family you live in, the work environment, the school you go to, the country you live in, all of these impacts that particular health. And the key part is that all of this is impacted by policy. Not by health policy, just by policy. If I as a country deny asylum to asylum seekers, that is not a health policy, but that has impact on the health of the forced migrant that comes in there. So all these things impact the health of the migrants, and the health of migrants, if you don't have a healthy migrant from pure economic sense, they're not able to work. So these are interlinked, and that's why we actually look into both factors as it is. Just can you change to not the next slide, the slide after that? I'm trying to save time. No, like forward. One more. So this is what we will discuss today in the panel. And that's why I have my esteemed members in the panel. And I think in the interest of time, I will not introduce them, rather they will introduce themselves. I think they know who they are much more than I do. And as we said, we are going to meet them after for the cultural event, so there'll be more time to talk about it. One key thing what I want to highlight is that we are going to see this from different perspectives. I have a global health background. I come from Uppsala. I teach global health and migration, and I see anything from health perspective. Gifty is a PhD student. She actually looks into migration from gender perspective, WASH perspective. Felipe is a demographer. He looks into numbers and stats. Dr. Joseph is from actually a practitioner, maybe the only practitioner amongst all of us standing here, I would say so, who is also actually a medical doctor, but also works on hands-on. Lothar, for example, cultural geographer, human geographer, right, from Radbourne. And Joe is more on migration, health, and governance. So you see, we try to tackle the questions from different perspectives. So I would start by, we can keep the responses short. Hopefully there'll be questions from the audience. Just one note, in the QR code you scanned before, there is also a place for you to ask questions. So ask there as well. We will try to have the mic around, but please ask questions on the Mentimeter thing I showed you before. Please do that. So you all had a chance to look at how our colleagues actually saw about migration policy, migration health policy from AU and EU perspective. So of course I seen there are some similarities, there also seems to be some differences. So if I start with the first question, if you keep your response to a minute and a half max. Is there an African perspective? And how would that differ from a EU perspective, if it differs, on migration health policy? Would there be one more? Okay. The floor, you can start.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as our chair said, I'm Joseph Corti. I'm with Port Health, and where I find myself as a medical practitioner, in terms of African perspective, if you look at migration health, so someone will ask you, what are the drivers of migration in Africa, and how is it linked with health? So with the African perspective, migrating is mainly a source of livelihood. But we all know once human beings are moving, we move with health issue. So let's say the drivers, economic issues, and people are actually moving to seek for better health care as well. So Africans moving to the European community. So for the destination countries, we have better health care as well. So that's the African perspective. But comparing it with the European perspective, I would say it's about health security. It's about health governance. So their policy is to ensure the migrants coming to Europe, they are actually healthy. Are there any communicable disease? Or are they non-communicable? Are they actually fit to come into our country? So if you know, with the IOM, there is health assessments before the migrants actually go to the destination country. So someone will ask, why all these measures in place? To ensure and also to reduce the transmission of infectious disease. So that's why we inform the European countries, these are the people coming to our country. And in terms of non-communicable disease, they know the disease burden. Their health facilities are actually ready. So that's in the African perspective and also the European perspective.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Joseph. Lothar, please.
Yeah, I think the question is a hugely complex one, of course. But to tackle it and to sort of extend on to what Joseph was saying, I think, and the historians here might thank me for this, I think there's also a time dimension to this, a temporal dimension, which is that when we look at a migrant moving and we look at the person sort of being in another place for a long time, then their health situation might change over that time. And that has an implication, of course, for whose burden is it in the end. For instance, when somebody has been working in a factory or has been working in cleaning, for instance. This is something that's very big in the Netherlands, where I'm from. For 10 or 20 years, who will fix the broken back? Who will sort of take it forward from there? And this is where you can see that the question is very different from an African perspective, which is about the migrant being sent off. But then who will they receive back, right? And then who's responsible for that part of the conversation? So I think this is where we need to understand that the mic is going powerful. This is where we need to understand that there's a difference of perspective from the start, but it also changes over time. So I think that dynamic needs to be taken on board.
Thank you. It was great actually also that you brought up like from the African perspective and how you see for using IOM and other agents as an example, and you see like from sort of a daily life, what migrants engage and how you see that. Jo, please.
Thanks. Afternoon, everyone. I'm Jo Veery from the African Centre for Migration and Society, the ACMS at Wits University. It's wonderful to be here, and congratulations again to our friends at CMS for celebrating your 20 years. I think that one of the things we also need to really think about, I come from a public health perspective, is why should we care about health in this context? It's not just about the health of individuals, it's about the health of communities and populations, it's about the way in which health is used as a kind of leverage point when we're thinking about governance and policy making. And it does differ when we look at what's happening within the context of the EU and the AU. I think as Lothar was alluding to, what's really important to remember is it's about the contexts in which different migrant groups move, live, work, return, or are intercepted if we want to talk about spaces of detention, for example. And people's health status is cumulative. So it changes during the migration journey, it changes over time and place, and it isn't something that's static. And one of the things that we really struggle with when we're looking at the migration governance terrain, or when we add health into it, is our responses tend to focus on one point in time. So one place and one moment in time. And the irony of migration research more broadly is we're not actually very good at doing real-time, real live, kind of on-the-move research. And that's something that we see a big gap with when we're looking at the field of migration and health research. So I think that we need to think about what the kind of drivers are for people to be interested in that research within the AU and within the EU context. We're increasingly seeing borders becoming increasingly securitized in many regions, and we're seeing health again returning to the idea of the thread of the migrant body and seeing health being used as another layer in our securitized spaces. And we should be really pushing back on that. And I think our colleague here was saying, when you look at port health and the concerns around global health security, we see countries like South Africa, for example, using a global health security mandate to justify increasingly restrictive policies. And that's particularly in the aftermath of COVID. But we've got a real careful role to play when we're thinking about how the idea of someone's health status can be misappropriated to see who is given the right or the permission to move or not.
Thanks a lot, Jo. Gifty, please go ahead. You have been in Ghana, you have been doing your studies, you have done going through a PhD, but you've also been to Europe, in Sweden particularly. So, because policies are supposed to be translated in practice, right? So if you compare your experience through studies, but also lived experience, what difference do you see in the perspectives, how migration health is discussed, or migration in both sides?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think for the African perspective, we also have to note this. We should avoid presenting them as monolithic points, but rather they intersect. So the African perspective mostly bring forth this medical term when it comes to health. Most of the times when we talk about health, people relate it to nurses, doctors, but then it goes beyond that. The structural drivers, the determinant, the social determinants needs to be emphasized. So in the African context, most of the times when we talk about health, it's just about a doctor, it's just about malaria. A clear example is when we conducted the research, the IDRC data collection in Ghana and then Liberia. Yes, the data spoke about typhoid, cholera, and then malaria. But then why these persist, most of the times we do not ask. Most of the times we do not ask. So most of the time when it comes to health, we mostly conceptualize it as medical, doctor, nurses, but it goes beyond that. Even the conditions surrounding migrants during transit, before transit, and then even during arrival is very important. The European perspective will mostly conceptualize migration and health as governance reforms. So when a migrant is going to Europe, to an European, it's more like, what are you coming with? They treat it as a crisis. But then in the African perspective, movement is about livelihood. It's about trying to get something it's about survival. But then to an European, it's about what is this migrant coming with? So I think both contexts treat it differently in terms of Africa introduces a contextual validity, whilst the European context introduces more like governance reforms, seeing it as a crisis rather than an opportunity. But then even within the European context and the African context, the countries treat it differently. But then this is the bigger picture, I think of. Yeah, thank you.
Right. When you're saying about health, I see the only doctor amongst us actually shaking the head how health is being perceived, right? So it's not just how migration is perceived differently, but also health and how people look into it, rather than what Joe was saying about security threat. Felipe, please.
Yeah, to continue on the idea of migration as being an opportunity for those who live it, and a threat or a burden for those who see it from outside. And of course, we may think that African perspective is always from the point of view of migrants, and the European perspective is from the point of view of the destination and the infrastructure or the system, the health system. But actually, it might be also a question of looking at the point of view of the origin and the point of view of the destination. And in that case, every country is a destination at the same time as an origin. And depending on the circumstances, the moment in history, a country might be more emitting migrants than receiving migrants. And we see that also in Europe. In Spain, in Italy, there were a lot of emigration as well as now immigration. So I would say that to be on the optimistic side, we should see it not so much as an African-European divide, but more as, okay, what's the point of view of the origin, what's the point of view of destination, and how can we reconcile that through comparative studies that will cross largely borders and those very broad divides. Okay.
Great thought. So the point you mentioned was that also, I think, refers to what Lothar said, the time perspective. Like in Europe, you gave sample. Like Ireland is a wonderful example. So till the mid-90s, that was a country of origin because a lot of Irish people actually moved to the UK, to the US, and so on. Since the mid-90s, they say it's because of the Celtic Tiger, the economic boom. It actually is one of the largest, proportionally, one of the largest countries receiving migrants. The impact's also quite clear. So it was only, I don't know how right or wrong it is. Last year, for the first time, they introduced a new ethnic category in the census data collection called Black Irish. And from a pure statistical point of view, it's to collect and it's to see who has the challenges, who has the opportunities, but also how things have changed. So time is very important, because my next question is actually like, why and how? It's a rhetorical question, but why is an African perspective, accepting that it's not one perspective, it's multiple perspective, relevant in the AU-EU migration policy? But Felipe, you're also referring to that. Maybe we should look into it like that. Maybe we should look into just one country and the other and goes like. But I think, at least based on what we heard in the morning, there are also concerns saying that African researchers used as resources for data, not as co-producers, and so other concerns, right? So let's start step by step. Why is an African perspective required within the AU-EU? If you see as a continuum, if you see that as perspective, is relevant within the policy discussion on migrant health. The floor is open. Anybody can start.
Okay, thank you. So as I said earlier, I think that the African perspective introduced a contextual validity. So most of the times, okay, we mostly use large data sets from WHO, IOM, but then the question is why these figures? So the lived realities, as I said, most of the times when they move, it's because of livelihood. They experience a lot. That is when qualitative research comes in. So the lived experiences is very important. Else, when we have interventions, a risk being externally imposed on these people. But then we need to have an internal imposition, because if I am in my community, so there was this very example where a researcher went to a community and decided to build a toilet facility beside a cemetery without consulting the indigents. They didn't use the toilet facility. Why? Because to them, it's a violation. Their ancestors have been buried over there. So you need the context, the interviews, to be able to understand and then explain the large data sets we use. So it's not about disengaging them, but rather trying to intersect and explain them and making it make sense, so that you do not impose something you haven't really learned from the indigents. Because if you sit in Europe, if you stay in Europe and then impose your policies on Africans without knowing the context, without knowing the stories, then it becomes abstract to them. So there's a need to have these experiences integrated. Thank you.
Because I was actually recalling the discussion we had in the morning about the indigenous population and how they, I think maybe, I could be wrong here, maybe Lothar, you might be best placed to respond to Gifty's idea of traditional values and how the practice get in. But also, I'm also reacting to what Gifty said. Please jump in, I want this to be a conversation. When policies are put on Africans, why is that feeling? Yeah.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes, now it's on. So I was going to make a totally different comment, but thank you, Chair, for jumping in with this. No, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a geographer, so my modesty is important here. But I think indeed these questions are important. A simple anecdote tells you the precarity, I think, of migrants in Europe. And one is particularly those that are there informally, right? I don't want to use the term illegal, I think this is the wrong term. Informal is the term to use here. So this was an example of a friend who cycled with a migrant, a former refugee, but now migrants with status, through the city of Nijmegen, where I live, and there was a traffic light. This was in the middle of the night. There was no one there. He rode on, but the migrant stopped. So he says, "Why did you stop?" And he says, "Because I don't want to break any laws, even if there's nothing, because it pushes me back so far." And I think this precarity is something that is super important. So we talk about cultures, but we also talk about institutions and about the distrust or the fear sometimes of these institutions. So I think when we sort of transpose this onto the field of health, which is what we're talking about here, then the question is also, we now speak, we're now living in an era where we're recognizing around the world that we're actually beginning to have a graying population, right? Not in Africa, but elsewhere. So with that graying population, slowly, countries like, for instance, Germany are beginning to recognize that maybe we should start thinking differently about migrants, not as opportunity seekers, but actually as a necessary group that we need to keep our population viable, literally, but also to keep it running, right? To keep our economy running. This is, I think, the point at which the African continent as a continent, maybe more than as individual sets of countries, needs to jump in and say, that's all great, but now we've been paying the bill for the education, for the trainings of these people. Now we need to start saying, okay, let's take that bill into account. And it's not only the bill of the past, right? It's not only about the education that people had and who's paying for that bill when someone else is profiting, but it's also about sort of what about the bill for the future? These people are not present. So that's why I think we need to think about in a very different way about this nexus, if you like, of migration with health as being much more of a continuous mobility of capital, in which, of course, these people still need to have their individual roles to play, but where at a governance level, there needs to be much more of a clear idea that the African continent should not be paying the bill anymore.
Would I be wrong to sort of maybe interpret, you're definitely referring to the brain drain, brain gain part of it, like, with people who skilled. I think those also come and raised before lunch,
Yes.
like we have doctors and nurses, why can't we send them there?
Yeah.
But also then, like, there are a lot of stats from data showing that actually say that there are actually more, I don't know if it's Nigerian or Ghanaian doctors and nurses in the UK per capita than actually it's in Ghana or Nigeria.
Correct.
And how that actually plays a role. But then are you also then implying that migration should not be seen as a linear line, rather as a continuum, like, people go and then bring, and because you're losing something, and
Yeah.
then
Yeah. No, so I think the term is not brain gain or brain regain or brain circulation, but it's brain sustain.
okay,
So this is the difference is here is that we're not looking at a short-term effect or a short-term shock on systems where there's a difference, of course, of what people can be provided in terms of income. So this is
Right.
what leads to the choice. And that's, of course, always an individual choice, right? We
Right.
should not contest this. But rather it's about saying, okay, so why is that difference occurring is because of a systemic difference of how we reward this. And this is where the difference should be what is